Las Vegas, New Mexico, December 29th, 1880. The notorious gang of outlaws who, under the leadership of Billy the Kid, have overrun eastern New Mexico, murdering and committing other deeds of outlawry, was broken up last Saturday morning by the killing of 2 and the capturing of 4 others, including the leader. The prisoners were lodged in Las Vegas jail, and threats of lynching were prevalent, but the vigilance of the captors, Deputy Sheriff Garrett and others, prevented. Yesterday afternoon, Garrett and the other captors boarded the train with the prisoners for Santa Fe. The sheriff's posse crowded about the train. Nearly every window of the cars served as a porthole for rifles. Detective J.T. Morley of the Post Office Department jumped into a cab with a pair of 6-shooters and told the engineer to let her go. I'm David Olusoga, and welcome to Journey Through Time.
And I'm Sarah Churchwell.
And that was a Philadelphia newspaper article from late December 1880 describing the dramatic capture of the legendary outlaw, Billy the Kid.
That's right, David. Today, we are telling the true story of one of the most legendary figures in American history. Billy the Kid was once the most famous outlaw in America. I mean, he was synonymous with the Wild West for generations. He was a teenage desperado. That was the word they would use to describe him. And he was said to have killed 21 men before he was shot dead at 21. That is one of the many legends of Billy the Kid that we'll be unpacking today.
And there are many, many legends.
There are many legends, and that word legend is key here. We're going to be looking at the history. That legend was built up through what were called dime novels. We've mentioned those before, which is basically very cheap popular novels in the 19th century, and folk ballad songs, pulp magazines, and of course, Hollywood Westerns. There have been countless retellings of this story of Billy the Kid. The legend has been endlessly remade. And actually, over the course of the 20th century, there was kind of a new Billy the Kid for each generation. He was constantly reimagined, recast as our ideas about the American frontier changed over time. So Billy the Kid has been variously rebel, folk hero, psychopath, freedom fighter. Any iteration of how you might want to see an outlaw cowboy has been played through in the stories that have been told about him. And that sense of constant reinvention has actually made him a touchstone for changing ideas about America and American identity. So, I'm getting a little bit of indication that today maybe his fame is fading a little bit. There hasn't been a major retelling of his story recently, although for all I know, maybe there's one in the works and Netflix has a big Billy the Kid series about to come out, in which case, Netflix, give us a call. We're here. Happy to talk. But, that myth still, I think, very much shapes how we tell stories about frontier justice and the stories that we tell about the Wild West. And I think, what we'll hear as we tell the story of Billy the Kid is so many tropes, so many familiar ideas about the Wild West, and how many of them come from or kind of strike a chord with the story of Billy the Kid. It's like he was written for the legends of the Wild West. It's like so symbolic of the stories of the Wild West.
And we're going to get into the real story behind this, which is in some ways kind of as fascinating as the legend. But part of that story is how the legend is emerging as the real lives, the real tragedies are playing out.
Yeah. And it's a really fascinating part of the story, exactly, is that they're kind of fictionalizing it almost as they go. It's almost that fast. And so the legend is baked into the history itself and actually shapes some of the outcomes as well. The origins of the Billy the Kid story are surprising in and of themselves. So it's actually the story of an Englishman who came to America and how he accidentally set the stage for what would become, this most enduring outlaw myth in America. It's the story of how a teenage hired gun was drawn into a feud. He didn't start the feud. His name was actually Henry McCarty, but he was known as Billy the Kid. And next week, we'll tell the story of how that boy became a legend.
I began the episode with a quote that was from a newspaper report from Las Vegas. We should explain that's not the Las Vegas you might be thinking of.
Yeah, you read out Las Vegas, New Mexico. And when you first encounter that in the story, you can kind of do a double take, can't you? And think, wait, Las Vegas isn't in New Mexico. Everybody knows Las Vegas is in Nevada. But there is another Las Vegas, New Mexico. It is still there. In fact, Las Vegas means the meadows or fertile plains. So it's, it was a popular name for these settlement towns.
I love the irony of Las Vegas meaning fertility and green.
I know, right? And green space.
Rather
exactly.
than neon.
In a desert, exactly, exactly, which is what we all picture, of course, in Las Vegas, Nevada. But Las Vegas, New Mexico is a different city. It was founded in 1835. It's actually older than Las Vegas, Nevada. Las Vegas, New Mexico came first. And as I said, it's still there. It's about 65 miles from Santa Fe, which is probably the place in New Mexico that most listeners are familiar with.
Yeah, that's a rather cool town these days, Santa Fe.
Yeah, it's quite fashionable, really. It was less fashionable in the 1870s and 1880s, but it was a key stop on the Western kind of trading route. In fact, it was called the Santa Fe Trail. It was named for Santa Fe. It was kind of a frontier version of the Silk Road. It was our commercial artery that went across the Southwest before there were railroads. So there was this cowboy linking road that was known as the Santa Fe Trail. And one of the things that's interesting about, noting that there was a Las Vegas, New Mexico is just that it reminds us how fluid the American West was at this point in time, and that we have to remove some of our preconceptions about where we think state boundaries are and where we think everything is. Because in 1880, when this story takes place, New Mexico was still a territory. It hadn't become a state yet. And that actually is an important part of how the story unfolds.
We're right in the middle here of that period that is often called the Wild West or the Old West. We're in the period of the American frontier, where America is forging. America that began on the East Coast is surging across the continent towards the coasts, and territories are slowly becoming states. Land is being seized and farmed and taken.
And of course, that land is being seized and taken from indigenous people who have already been some of them were already west, some have been pushed west with the promise that they would be able to retain that land. And then these waves of European settlers continue to move west and take that land and to settle it for themselves. And the conflict that movement and that settlement, that colonization engendered over the course of the 1870s and 1880s is what gives rise to so much of the violence that is what is mythologized in the stories of the Wild West. So of course, quote unquote, cowboys and Indians, that's what you're talking about, is actually the conflict over the seizure of land, and the seizure of land against explicit treaties with the native people. And that comes into the story of Billy the Kid. It comes into most stories of the Wild West, because as we said, that is actually what's happening.
Can I ask one detail about the newspaper article that I read at the beginning? The man who gets on the train towards the end of that passage with a 6-shooter, it said he was from the post office.
I'm so glad you noticed that, David. Isn't it funny? I love that moment. And the post office detective, again, it's a moment that makes you do a kind of double take, isn't it? Where you go, hang on, the post office was hunting Billy the Kid? I don't think I understand. Was he engaged in mail fraud? What was going on? Stealing people's letters? It sounds so petty and, kind of comical. But it actually is revealing. And again, it's about the fluidity of the Wild West, because the law was enforced by anyone with authority. And the U.S. Post Office did have its own detectives, in fact, chasing fraud, but very importantly, protecting mail coaches, because mail coaches could be sending valuables. So they had detectives to protect that. And they could be basically, roped into law enforcement if they were needed. They might ride armed with a sheriff in, a place like New Mexico where the law enforcement is, few and far between. And it just reminds us how improvised law enforcement on the frontier was. It had to be. And it was often federal only in name. And that creates a blurring of power, right? Sometimes it's freelance, it's mercenary. People aren't sure who's in charge. And that's a very unstable situation as well, especially if you've got everybody running around with guns. And that reality is the story that also, really shapes what happens with Billy the Kid.
Because this is one of the cliches of the kind of Western movies that's actually true, that there were posses. People were deputized for a short period of time for a specific mission, that you could find yourself kind of imbued with the power of the law and then have that power taken away. And that's going to be part of this story.
It's a really important part of the story. People are deputized and then not deputized and then deputized and then not deputized. So are you a lawman or not a lawman? So it's very situational, and it means that the lines around authority become really blurred. Who's on the side of the law? And in a sense, a criminal can literally be deputized and then chase somebody else as a criminal. So at any given point in time, who's the criminal and who's the law? We did, on our recent episode on the NRA, we were talking about how the history of guns and gun violence in the Wild West is often mythologized and exaggerated, and that, there was a fair amount of gun control. But of course, that shouldn't be overstated. And the stories of the Wild West are there for a reason. There was gun violence in the Wild West, obviously. And the story of Billy the Kid is very much a story about that gun violence, kind of running rampant.
And particularly in New Mexico. And I think it's very significant that this story of Billy the Kid is going to take us into New Mexico. That's the background in which it takes place.
Yeah. And it's a space that's still contested. I mean, that name says a lot, New Mexico. And there is a lot of movement across the border into what they called Old Mexico. And the sense that New Mexico was very much inhabited at the time by mixed Hispano communities. Of course, there are indigenous people there as well. And then you have this influx of white settlers. We also need to remember that New Mexico territory at the time is a much bigger place than the state of New Mexico, because it also covered most of what is now Arizona. So we've got this very big area, very sparsely governed, with a very mixed population. And although the population is majority Hispano and indigenous, it's dominated by the interests of these Anglo settlers. So that's our big context and our background. But our story takes place actually in a relatively small part of New Mexico called Lincoln County, which was a territory with a county seat about 60 miles from the town of Roswell. For those who are familiar with stories of UFO sightings, which is what it's now best known for. So if you know the map of New Mexico at all, you should be picturing somewhere in the vicinity of Roswell. That's where all of this action takes place in and around Lincoln County.
And there's lots of mention of Lincoln Town, Lincoln County Jail in country and western songs. It's mentioned in some of the songs of Bob Dylan. And the reason why songwriters kind of grasp for Lincoln in the 1870s, 1880s is because of the story of Billy the Kid.
Absolutely. And he is a folk hero, and that kind of energy of wanting to tell, create folk stories, folk legends, and folk ballads out of the stories of Billy the Kid is very organic. Now, Bob Dylan had a specific reason for writing songs about Billy the Kid, which we'll come back to later in our story.
Hey, any excuse to get Bob Dylan in the story, I'm very up for.
Yeah. Well, we've got a few, so you're in luck. So Lincoln County, New Mexico, at this point in time was run by a kind of cartel that was known as the House. And the House was a monopoly. It was a bunch of ranchers, merchants, lawmen. It was basically the guys who were in charge. And they ran everything in the area. Again, this should feel really familiar to anybody who's ever seen a Western. There are the guys who are in charge, and David, it's going to shock you when I tell you that these men were corrupt. So we have a corrupt monopoly in charge, like the start of any good Western. In this case, the corrupt monopoly, the House, was led by ex-cavalry officers. They were named Murphy and Dolan, just to keep things straight. So that's the House is Murphy and Dolan, and they were backed by a bigger cartel, a crony capitalist cartel known as the Santa Fe Ring, which basically controls New Mexico. And of course, the kind of fluid, large territory with intermittent law enforcement is rife for corruption. So it's hardly a surprise that it took hold in areas like this before the coming of law enforcement.
As you can tell from their names, Murphy and Dolan are Irish. They're Irish immigrants. And when you say they're cavalry officers, they've served in the Civil War. And the fact that this is a moment in the 1870s where the country is just full of men who've been to war, that's going to shape some of the attitudes and a lot of the violence of this story.
It absolutely does. And it's a really fascinating part of the Wild West that doesn't make it into very many of the Hollywood versions, although it makes it increasingly into some of the revisionist Westerns, is the fact that once you finish fighting the Civil War, your allegiances haven't necessarily changed. And so you actually end up with these skirmishes that are kind of replaying some of those fights between North and South, because Confederate soldiers who went to war to fight for slavery are not going to go west and suddenly decide that, racial equality is fine with them. They were literally fighting a war to keep slavery. So those tensions and those ideologies continue to play out across the stage of the West after the Civil War. It's not as if they stopped when the Civil War ended. So you're going to sort of see some of the Wild West as playing out some of the Civil War and proxy battles, even in certain kinds of skirmishes. And again, that's part of what's happening here to a certain extent in a kind of diffuse way. So as I said, the House runs everything in Lincoln County. It runs land sales, it runs the bank, it runs law enforcement. Their general store is the bank. It's all kind of mashed up, and they own everything. And the law enforcement in the area acts for them. So it's basically their muscle rather than any kind of force of justice.
And this is the sheriff, William Brady, who's another Irish immigrant like Murphy and Dolan. He's basically in their pocket, isn't he?
Yeah, he's 100% in their pocket. He's kind of notoriously corrupt in the area. Everybody knows that he just works. He's their hired hand. He's their hitman. Now, there is a federal force in the area that was sent by the U.S. government with a nominal kind of oversight. And that federal force was actually several units of African-American cavalrymen who were known as Buffalo Soldiers. Now, David, I know you've actually, you're very interested in Buffalo Soldiers too. You and I have both spent some time looking into them because the history of Buffalo Soldiers is absolutely fascinating. And the story of Buffalo Soldiers actually becomes an important part of how the legend of Billy the Kid evolves.
It's an amazing story that we should definitely come back to. African Americans in the U.S. Army after the Civil War, involved in all sorts of different conflicts.
The nickname actually came from indigenous people, right, who are likening African Americans to the buffalo. But you need to remember when we think about that nickname that, of course, for indigenous people, the buffalo are revered.
Yeah, they're sacred.
They're sacred. And so the cavalrymen knew this. So they actually knew that the name was an honorific. They bore the name with pride. Some of them put it in their coats of arms. It was literally a badge of honor to be called a Buffalo Soldier. And the Buffalo Soldiers were instrumental in moving New Mexico and Arizona into statehood. Now, it's worth asking the question of why the U.S. government sent African American soldiers to oversee the Southwest. And the answer is, as it always is Jim Crow, right? Because white Southerners don't want armed Black soldiers anywhere near them. And, we're talking about how this is the aftermath of the Civil War. And we were talking in our story about the NRA about how much violence in the post-war South was actually driven by the desire to disarm Black people. So the idea that they would accept the authority of armed Black soldiers it was absolutely unthinkable to them. And of course, it's not as if Northern white people were really welcoming armed Black troops either. But the army was underpopulated, they under-resourced, they needed all the men that they could get. So they sent the Buffalo Soldiers southwest, where it sort of didn't matter, where they'd be out of the sight of the white population who would be made anxious by armed Black people. And they could be sent there to try to force the Native Americans onto the reservations and to kind of try to keep things quiet between Anglos and Hispanic communities. But at the end of the day, the federal government was kind of shrugging its shoulders about that violence. And if the Buffalo Soldiers couldn't do it, well, too bad. And so that's actually why they end up in places like that, is because of the racism in the East that drives the Buffalo Soldiers west.
So this is the world in Lincoln County in New Mexico that we're going to find Billy the Kid in the 1870s. But before we find him, we've got to introduce the Englishman that you mentioned earlier.
So into this world, this, chaotic, multicultural, tense, fractious world enters, a 24-year-old Englishman named John Tunstall. He was well off. He was backed by some money. He had some investment, and he had a good eye for business opportunity. And he could see that there were real, chances here for somebody with, energy, ambition, a little bit of opportunism. And he, went west to make his fortune.
He's a sort of middle-class guy from London. It's amazing how many of the characters that we're going to meet come from the British Isles and Ireland. John Tunstall's is English, Murphy and Dolan are Irish, Brady, the sheriff who's in their pocket is Irish. And also John Tunstall's business partner, Alexander McSween, he's Canadian-Scottish.
You know, we talk about the 19th century as being a time of waves of migration in America, but this kind of story really brings home what that meant, that all of these different cultures are in one place kind of clashing with each other. And they have different politics, they've got different religions, different ideologies, different languages, and they're all here and they're all trying to make a buck. They can all see that there's an opportunity here, but so their interests are very much in conflict very, very quickly.
Whenever I watch a Western, and I've already said I'm not a great fan of Westerns, the thing that drives me crazy
You try to avoid
is
them,
why do they have American accents? Half of these guys are Irish, half of them are English or Scottish. If you think about this story, the accents in which these confrontations that involve Billy the Kid that we're going to talk about, the accents in these moments, they're from the British Isles and Ireland. They're not American.
Mm. Well, and there are a great many people who are Spanish speakers as well, from many different Hispano backgrounds, who become an important part of the story in a moment as well. So we also need to hear people speaking, and it's not people speaking English with a Spanish accent. It's bilingual people code switching between English and Spanish. So we should be hearing the story in Spanish. And in fact, the story ends in Spanish as well. I'll give a little teaser there for where the story takes us. So we're moving in and out of English and Spanish. And we're hearing it in all different accents. It's not just that they all have American accents, but of course, until at least the 1990s, any Hollywood version, they were all white. Every single person in the Wild West was white in Hollywood. So we need to also be picturing a very mixed race, multicultural environment. So Tunstall teams up with this guy, McSween, who's a lawyer, a former preacher. He actually used to work for the house. He was once one of he was in their pocket, but they've had a falling out and he knows where the bodies are buried. So literally as well as figuratively. And so he wants to take them on. And so he and Tunstall set out to challenge the house's monopoly. Now, as you've said, Tunstall is a middle-class Englishman. There is actually a surviving photo of him, and he looks much more like a banker than like a cattleman. He does not look like a cowboy in this picture. He's clean shaven. He's got these kind of soft eyes. Like he just doesn't look like he would last a hot second in the Wild West. Can't really picture him out there at all. But you can picture him in Hollywood, the Englishman fish out of water who, is wearing tweeds while everybody else around him is in fringed leather and that kind of thing. That's really what he looks like. McSween was more hard bitten. He'd been West for a while. And as I say, he worked for the house and he knew kind of how their organization worked. And crucially, he knew that their finances were shaky. So although they appear to be this all-powerful monopoly, in fact, they're doing all kinds of dubious things behind the scenes, and it's made their own finances unstable. And so together, McSween and Tunstall decide that they're going to make a play for the house's most lucrative contract, which is provisioning the nearby Mescalero Apache Reservation.
We'll be hearing more about the Mescalero later on and about the corruption that's involved in their treatment. But it's out of these tensions between Tunstall and Dolan and Murphy, between the house and this young Englishman, that's what brings Billy the Kid into this story in Lincoln County in New Mexico.
Yeah, Billy the Kid enters what is basically an ongoing feud, a feud that has begun. And Tunstall has to hire a crew, of course, to support him. And as you mentioned, David, the Murphy-Dolan group is strongly Anglo-Irish, Scottish, but Tunstall hires a much more diverse crew, a crew that's much more representative of the communities that we've been talking about. He's got Anglo and Hispano cowboys riding together. One of the guys that he hires is a teenage drifter who's made his way into the area. He's a kid with a criminal record. His name is Henry McCarty, but he's already known at that point as William Bonney, and they call him the Kid.
And after the break, we'll see how this teenager becomes the legend of Billy the Kid. Welcome back. We were in the 1870s in Lincoln County in New Mexico, and Billy the Kid, or the teenager who's going to become Billy the Kid, has arrived. But his story doesn't begin in the Wild West. It begins in New York 2 decades earlier.
Yeah. William Bonney, his name was Henry McCarty at birth, and then he became known as William Bonney. He was born in New York in 1859, but he moved west with his mother when he was a child. So he basically grew up in the West. It was the world that he knew.
So born in 1859 in New York, his mother was an Irish migrant. I mean, the math's there. The Irish famine's 1845 to 1852. The likelihood is that she is what is called famine Irish. She's somebody who escaped from one of the greatest disasters in British history and had a child in New York, which is where the Irish flocked to escape the famine.
It's a classic story. It's highly likely, statistically probable that that's what happened. And she moves west with Billy as a kid, which means she's either moving west during the Civil War or just after the Civil War has ended, looking for opportunity. But she died when Billy was just 15. And he was left with a disinterested stepfather, and they didn't get along. And before long, the young teenager had gotten into trouble. So he was arrested for petty theft as a 15-year-old. He was stealing from a Chinese laundry. It's a detail that makes me laugh for some reason. Again, I think because the way we were saying, it's such an undramatic start for the desperado who's going to become Billy the Kid to be stealing clothes out of a laundry or something. But that's what he did. And he got arrested, and then he escaped from jail through a chimney. It was actually the start of many escapes from jail, as we will hear.
This is the first of many, as you say, and that is really one of his specialisms that feeds into the legend. That is, he is somebody who's quite often caught by the law, but not often kept hold of by the law.
Yeah, that's it. And he really did have this kind of extraordinary ability to escape. There's going to be a lot of aspects of Billy the Kid's story that sound like Hollywood legends, but are actually true. And that's one of them, was that he just kept breaking out of jail.
But at this point, he's a teenager. He's also an orphan. And I think, there's this kind of powerful romantic legend. The other way of thinking about it is, here is a teenager who's just lost his mother, whose stepfather doesn't really have any interest in him. His very first offense is stealing food. That speaks to a sort of really desperate plight. I mean, the picture you get before this legend has been built is, of a child, basically, in a desperate place.
He was called the Kid from fairly early on because he was a kid. He was kind of drifting around, and that escape through the chimney was dramatic enough that it actually got him noticed in the press as well. And that's the other thing about him, is that he's a little bit flamboyant because of some of his skills. He gets himself noticed. So he's this kid, he's orphaned, as you say, he's just kind of on his own, but he's quick and he's clever, and he gets himself out of tight situations, and people start to take notice. And so he just drifts for the next couple of years. He's doing all the things that, young drifters in the West would have been doing. He's stealing horses, he's gambling, he's gunslinging. He actually was getting very good with a gun very quickly. And by 17, he had killed a man in a dispute. He had a conflict with someone, and he shot him and killed him.
And this was not a premeditated murder. This was a bar fight that gets out of control. But this really is a sort of a line in the sand in his life, because he's now wanted, not for stealing from a Chinese laundry, but for murder.
Yeah, now he's a killer. He was arrested for this killing, and he was briefly held. And then guess what he did, David? He escaped.
Escape number 2.
Escape number 2. We're going to lose count pretty quickly. So he escaped, and then he's, roaming around the West again.
He's beginning to appear in the press. I mean, what picture do we get of him physically? Do we know what he looked like?
Well, the legend always says that he was small. And I assume because, again, this idea that he's a kid. But in fact, reporters did meet him. He became notorious enough that he was interviewed. And one of the reporters who met him said that he was 5'8" or 5'9".
So not small for the 1870s.
No, it's pretty tall for the time, actually. There is one very famous photo. It doesn't show him against anything else for relative size, but we can see that he's got a slim build. He's got light hair. He had clear blue eyes. And the reporter who met him said they had a roguish snap, that he was quite handsome and that he had agreeable and winning ways. He was actually pretty charming. People talked about how much they liked him. And I think charming not in like a smarmy, manipulative way, but genuinely charming. People liked him. He had a knack for making friends. There are letters from him that show that he had a sense of humor. There were lots of things that were appealing about him, actually.
And he was educated. I mean, you mentioned letters. This is a guy who can read and write.
Yeah, he was smart. And I think that meant that he was often underestimated. He also was courteous. He cultivated politeness. He was sort of well-dressed. So all of these things that feed into the legend, everybody loves all of these parts of the story. And one of the things that his contemporaries comment on, which again is such a Hollywood trope, but was, what we need to be clear about is how many of the Hollywood tropes come from Billy the Kid rather than Billy the Kid conforming to the Hollywood tropes, because he was fast on the draw. He was calm under pressure. He had a cool head, which they always talked about. And he was absolutely deadly at close range.
So he arrives in this world in Lincoln County, New Mexico, and he arrives into a deeply, deeply troubled world in which people are taking sides. And by taking a job, he ends up on one of those sides.
He's just a hired hand. He's a cowboy. So he's not being hired to engage in any criminal activity per se, except that, as we were saying earlier, David, the conflict and the kind of fluidity of the law means that at any given point, you might be on the side of the law or you might be on the side of crime, because it kept shifting back and forth. So they're willing to commit violence. They know that that's probably part of the contract, but he's not being hired for criminal activity per se.
But by being hired by John Tunstall, even to work effectively as a cowboy, not as a sort of gunslinger, means in effect he's on one side of the conflict between Tunstall and Dolan and Murphy.
Precisely. And what happens in the conflict is very quickly, it really just becomes cattle raids for various reasons. They just start stealing each other's cattle and, raiding each other's herds, claiming title to them. And then the other one will go over to the land and grab it back. And for a little while, they went back and forth doing this. It sounds all sort of petty, but there were reasons why they were doing it. And it was very common at the time, and cattle was valuable. So this was, one of the things that cowboys were hired to do. So in one of these back and forth, while they're stealing each other's cattle, John Tunstall gets word that the house has once again come to his land, is seizing his cattle, and he and his posse, his crew, including Billy the Kid, ride out to stop them. They weren't completely riding in a tight bunch like in Hollywood, and they get a little bit separated. And what happens is that Tunstall is ambushed by the house's posse. We've got to remember as well that we're on a wide expanse of land here.
This is a huge area.
And it's not all the kind of vast open desert that we picture from Hollywood as well. There are woods and trees and, there's little wooded areas and stuff. And that's actually where Tunstall ends up. He ends up in this little wooded area and he gets ambushed by the house's posse. And he is shot in the back of the head at point blank range.
I mean, this is an execution.
It's an execution. This is not a shootout. This is not, as we were saying with Billy, the Kid, having a dispute that escalates and ends in a killing when he was 17. This is little more than a hit. He is shot in the back of the head, and the shooters are riding with the house's corrupt sheriff, Brady, who we've already mentioned.
And the killing is witnessed by men who worked for John Tunstall, people for whom this guy who'd given them this job and these opportunities. I mean, there's a loyalty. They are kind of bonded together, and they see Tunstall with their own eyes killed in front of them. And,
Tunstall seems to have inspired a certain amount of loyalty. Billy the Kid's loyalty to this crew actually drives a lot of the story. So, it's really important that we not be trying to sound as if we're trying to heroicize Billy the Kid or to, recuperate him. But fair-mindedness means that we acknowledge his good qualities where they are. And certainly loyalty is one of Billy the Kid's virtues.
And that comes up repeatedly.
Totally comes out, and it drives what happens, because this Tunstall's murder ignites what becomes known as the Lincoln County War. Over the next few months, these two sides now are in open battle, and they are going to be fighting it out. So Billy the Kid and some of the Hispano cowboys from Tunstall's crew form a group known as the Regulators. And it's a vigilante posse that, as you say, David, they've sworn to avenge Tunstall's murder. That's what they're going to do. But because Tunstall's murder was clearly a cold-blooded killing, this is one of the moments when they're actually on the side of the law. So briefly, Billy the Kid and the Regulators are actually deputized under territory law to arrest Tunstall's killers.
So they are officially the good guys.
They're officially the good guys. But the problem is, who controls the law in Lincoln County is the House, their opponents. So everything is rigged against them. The sheriff, the prosecutors, the judges, the courts, they're all rigged. They're all in the House's pay. And the guys who just killed Tunstall literally ride with the sheriff. So you have a problem if you actually are trying to, work alongside that system. So they're actually partly riding in self-defense as well, partly because they were witnesses, partly because they still are fighting on the Tunstall-McSween side. They know that these guys are still going to be coming for them. But it is partly out of loyalty to Tunstall as well. It absolutely was.
The Irish writer Fintan O'Toole has written about Billy the Kid and about how many of these people, including Billy, are of Irish descent, or people who in some cases had left Ireland. And there is a sectarian element to this war in New Mexico in the 1870s, where Murphy and Dolan are Irish Catholics. Tunstall had been an English Protestant. There is this kind of like old world religious sectarianism playing out in the great open spaces of New Mexico. It's really quite bizarre. I mean, another thing that Fintan O'Toole's written about Murphy and Dolan is that they had, because they were older than Billy, they'd witnessed the Irish famine. And one of the arguments is it's one of the reasons why these men are so ruthless, so corrupt, is that they had been through one of the greatest disasters of the 19th century. And John Tunstall, an English guy, had turned up after England had failed to provide proper relief in the famine in the views of many people, and they weren't going to stand for it. So you have this kind of bizarre world where you have the Old West, the classic images of the Wild West, and these sectarian divisions from the British Isles and Ireland playing out in the open spaces of New Mexico. I mean, that's just bizarre.
Well, as we said though, David, I mean, the Wild West becomes a space where these proxy wars can get fought out. They can get refought or fought for the first time. And so I think, for me, a helpful way of thinking about these different conflicts in the Wild West is that we're talking about tribal identities, and we're accustomed to only thinking about tribal identities in the West as relating to indigenous people, but everybody has their tribal identity here. And all of these tribes are in open conflict for all of the reasons that you're talking about. All these different contexts come with you. You get into a fight with people over it. Now, one of the ones that we haven't really talked about yet, well, actually two that we haven't really talked about yet, is the role that the Hispano communities here are playing. And they're going to play an increasingly prominent part in the story of Billy the Kid, because that Murphy Dolan, the House faction, is, as you say, Anglo-Irish. Few Hispanos are supporting it. They have their own loyalties, and McSween and Tunstall hire heavily from the Hispano communities, and they have that strong sense of loyalty. So the people who are of various, Spanish American descents are aligned on the Billy the Kid side, basically.
These are older communities who've been in New Mexico for far longer.
Yeah. So they see themselves as the quote unquote native population who were there long before the Anglo population. And they, of course, resent the encroachments being made by the Anglo population. We call them the Hispano communities now just to recognize that they're all speaking Spanish, but they come from lots of different places. Sometimes people call it Latin, but means slightly different things. So these Spanish speaking communities who come from these different, parts, mostly south of the border, but not entirely. But they've now been in that area for a long time, and they see their interests as being aligned with the Tunstall-McSween faction because they want to take on the corruption of the House. The House doesn't support the Hispano community. They are pursuing, kind of Anglo interests, commercial interests, political interests, and the Hispano community wants to assert their interests. So they're with basically on the side of Billy the Kid. And then we mentioned earlier that what they're fighting over is this contract, which is to give the provisions from the U.S. government to the Mescalero Apache reservation, which is nearby. This was one of the House's major sources of income, is that they have the right to supply these reservations because the Mescalero Apaches had recently surrendered to the U.S. government as part of this long conflict with indigenous people. And they had been forced into surrendering. That Spanish name mescalero actually means mezcal eater. They got their name from hunting the agave plant used to make mezcal. So if you like a margarita.
The contract to supply them on their reservation is because them being on the reservation and getting supplies from the US government have been part of the terms of that surrender.
Yeah, it was what they got in exchange for surrendering was the promise that the government would provision them with supplies. They were supposed to get food, most importantly, of course, but also blankets, tools, what they needed to survive on the reservation. The House has that contract, so it's getting those provisions from the government, supposed to provide them to the reservation. But guess what? The corrupt House is not doing that.
So the government has outsourced this contract, the federal government, to a deeply corrupt group of people around Murphy and Dolan.
Yeah. And they're ripping off everybody, left, right, and center. So they're ripping off the government and they're ripping off the Mescalero Apaches. They're milking it for profit in every way that they can. So they skim supplies off the top. They take the good stuff. They sell it off. They make sure that the Mescalero Apaches only get substandard or limited provisions. So they're not getting what they need, what they've been promised. They also inflate the reservation numbers. So they claim that there are more people in the Mescalero Apache reservation than there actually were, so that again they can claim more, and then they pocket the difference. They sell the surplus goods on the side, so they're making money, every which way that they can. It's just a total racket. And it's important to say that as McSween and Tunstall come in, they're not coming in to save the Mescalero Apaches, to make sure that they get good food and the supplies that they've been promised. They see a racket and they see the opportunity to take it over. They want it for themselves.
They're not the saviors of the Mescalero Apache. They're people who think we can corruptly run this contract as corruptly as our rivals.
We can make money off of it too, or better. From the Mescalero perspective, this is just two Anglo gangs fighting over who gets to rob them. We were saying how the Hispanic community might align with Tunstall and McSween, but the Mescalero Apaches do not see it that way at all.
This is now an open conflict, though, isn't it, between the House, Murphy and Dolan, and people trying to avenge the death of John Tunstall.
Yeah. And it turns into a range war. So they are fighting all over this territory. And as part of that range war, McSween's men are actually raiding the reservations. They are grabbing food rations. They're killing Apache residents. And according to the Mescalero traditions, Billy the Kid is part of those raids. So they see him as a raider and a killer. They do not see him as a folk hero. And in April 1878, the regulators, this posse that Billy the Kid is part of, they ambush Sheriff Brady, that corrupt sheriff, this House's, enforcer. They ambush him in the street of Lincoln and they gun him down in broad daylight.
In the middle of the biggest town in the county.
Yeah, riddled with bullets, broad daylight, middle of the street. So although Billy the Kid is actually one of several shooters, this whole gang is shooting at Brady, he's actually the one indicted for Brady's murder. And from this point on, he becomes the most hunted man in the territory.
And he's hunted because this really is a premeditated murder. This is not a crime of passion. It's not the heat of the moment. And it's from this point onwards, April 1878, Billy the Kid has 3 years to live. And it's those 3 years that we'll be just exploring in the next episode, the years in which this legend of Billy the Kid is born.
So join us then. Look forward to seeing you.
Thanks for listening.